Most of them were against the war on what the editor called pragmatic grounds, meaning can't get away with it. A smaller percentage, I forget the numbers, I think maybe a third or so, were against the war on what they called moral grounds. Funny word. Moral grounds meant it's too bloody. In other words, you're killing too many children. You kill fewer children, it's okay. Then there was a tiny group, actually it was maybe 2 or 3 people in the sample, I was one of them, who were opposed to the war on what the editor called ideological grounds. Now, the term is interesting. Ideological is a bad word, What it means is that this statistically irrelevant sample, like 1% or something, were opposed to the war on principle, namely on grounds that aggression is wrong, even if it succeeds. See, if they had asked the question, what do you think about the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia? The question wasn't asked, but if it had been asked, everybody would have been against it. Nobody would have been against it on pragmatic grounds because it worked. And nobody would have been against it on what are called moral grounds because it wasn't bloody. They only killed 1 person or something. So it's on moral grounds. Everybody would have been against it on ideological grounds, except nobody would have called that ideological. You would have just called it human or principled
but
or something.
Not in the Soviet Union.
I'm talking about the United States.
Yeah, but don't put America on Russia's war.
Sorry.
Have the Soviet Union talking about Vietnam.
You're missing my point. My point is that in a U.S. study, opposition to an American war, to aggression on grounds of principle is called ideological, and it is marginal when it's U.S. aggression, and it's considered normal and proper when we're talking about Soviet aggression. Now, here's my point. At a time when the population was moving towards large-scale opposition to the war on grounds of principle, the intellectual elite was only by statistical error did you find anybody who was opposed on grounds of principle. And that's at the peak period of opposition to the war. I think those things are pretty revealing. In fact, I think there's, in my view at least, there's a kind of a split that's taken place in American culture, an interesting sort of split between educated elite opinion, which in fact is jingoistic and indoctrinated and reactionary and so on, whether it calls itself liberal or something else, and the general public, which is moving in another direction.
Noam Chomsky. I'm Lister Sinclair. This is reporter and filmmaker Kevin McMahon.
It's my impression that most of the population feels that it's being propagandized, and they turn more and more towards using media as strictly a source of entertainment. It's a postman idea about it doesn't really matter what they say because they say it so stupidly that people are just consuming it for a laugh. And I wonder if now that doesn't become more of a problem really than propaganda. I mean, despite the really impressive evidence that you amass, I don't think most people would be convinced by a couple of sentences saying we're propagandized. And so, yeah, I wonder if entertainment isn't really the greater problem now.
Yeah, I think what you said is very important. What I've been talking about gives a kind of a skewed picture. I maybe should have emphasized more, but remember, I'm talking about the elite media. The elite media target largely educated people. They target the political class, the more or less politically active class, a pretty small percentage of the population, the articulate elite intellectuals. And that's the kind of propaganda I've been talking about, and that's only a small part of the system. Things have to be done for the rest of the population, too. They have to be marginalized, but they're not going to be marginalized by telling them lies about foreign policy, because just as you say, they don't believe most of what they read. There's just a kind of a general populist skepticism, along with this sense that the government is run by a few big interests looking out for themselves, is the sense that the media are probably lying to us. So for most of the population, the media system is, I think, a different one. It's not just the case that it tries to entertain them. It tries to entertain them through means which will intensify attitudes that support the interests of elites. So you want, for example, let me give some cases. Take the emphasis on professional sports. Now, it sounds harmless, but it really isn't. Professional sports are a way of building up jingoist fanaticism. You're supposed to cheer for your own team. Just to mention something from personal experience, I remember very well myself when I was, I guess, a high school student, sudden revelation, when I asked myself, why am I cheering for my high school football team? I don't know anybody on it. If I met anybody on it, we'd probably hate each other. Why do I care whether they win or if some guy a couple blocks away wins? Well, and then you could say the same thing about, the baseball team or whatever else it is. This idea of cheering for your home team, which you mentioned before, that's a way of building into people irrational submissiveness to power, and it's a very dangerous thing. And I think that's one of the reasons it's such a big, it gets such a huge play. Let's move to something else. The indoctrination that's done by TV and so on is not trying to pile up evidence and give arguments and so on. It's trying to inculcate attitudes. I mentioned a couple of cases, but there are a lot more. Let's take, say, the bombing of Libya. Why did the American public support the bombing of Libya? Well, the reason is that there had been a very effective and careful and intense inculcation of racist attitudes about Arabs. I mean, anti-Arab racism is the one form of racism in the United States that's considered legitimate. I mean, plenty of people are racists, but you don't like to admit it. On the other hand, with regard to anti-Arab racism, you admit it openly. I mean, you read a journal like, say, The New Republic, and what the kinds of things that they say about Arabs, if anybody said them about Jews, you'd think you're reading Der Stürmer. I'm not joking. And nobody notices it, because Arab anti-racism is so profound. It shows up in literature. I mean, there are novels that have a form of anti-Arab racism that's hair-raising. Same is true of television shows and so on and so forth. An image has been created throughout a lot of the media are part of this, not all, of the Arab terrorist lurking out there ready to kill us. And against that background, you could bomb Libya and people would cheer. Recall how effective that was. Remember what was happening in 1986. There are a lot of measures of how effective this is. Remember that in 1986, when this happened, the tourism industry in Europe was virtually wiped out because Americans were afraid to go to Europe, where incidentally, objectively, they would be about 100 times as safe as in any American city. That's no joke. But they were afraid to go to Europe because they got these Arab terrorists out there trying to kill us, Now, that was not from New York Times editorials. That was from a whole array of television and novels and soap operas and, massive symbolism and so on and so forth, and that's effective. I mean, that's the anti-communist hysteria is developed that way too. The communists are out there ready to kill us. Who are the communists? I don't know. They're out there ready to kill us. This is introduced by the kinds of symbolism that TV is good at and cheap novels are good at and so on, and that's important. These are critical means of indoctrination. It's just that I wasn't talking about them. I was talking about the more intellectual side.